The president of El Salvador said at a Bitcoin conference over the weekend that supposedly was pretty good, that they're moving to make Bitcoin legal tender and include it in, frankly, a bunch of different ways in the country. We don't have all the details on this yet, but we do have a little bit of video from the announcement. If we can go to that now.
In El Salvador, we are trying to rescue this idea and start the design of a country for the future, using the best ingredients that makes us who we are, while using sensibility to find the best examples of ideas from history and around the world. I believe Bitcoin could be one of these ideas. That is why next week, I will send to Congress a bill that will make Bitcoin a legal tender in El Salvador. In the short term, this will generate jobs and help provide financial inclusion to thousands outside the formal economy. And in the medium and long term, we hope that this small decision can help us push humanity at least a tiny bit into the right direction. I entered politics to leave a legacy for my country, but while doing it and by working with like-minded people, maybe we can help create a legacy for the world.
So now, El Salvador, not a big country, but this is actually a pretty big announcement. David, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the most important context here is that El Salvador already uses the dollar as its primary currency. So they're already kind of subject to external monetary influence. And I think this is a really good example of maybe they'd rather be subject to the outside influence of a neutral system like Bitcoin rather than a currency that's actually controlled by a separate government. One other piece of context here that is important and we will expand on, but this announcement came almost simultaneously with the announcement that the president of El Salvador's government was going to be withdrawing from an anti-corruption investigation, and that has kind of upset and worried people in the U.S., which has sort of had some concerns about his authoritarianism. But, you know, we can get deeper into that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because David, what you said is absolutely correct. They've been using the US dollar as their denomination, right? And it's important to see, like, what happens when there's a separation of money and state? What kind of money do the people choose? And they're going with Bitcoin because, you know, in the US, there's so many incentives to print money and it ends up hurting a lot of people. And then in El Salvador, they're like, hey, we don't want to be hurt by the US's money printing. It's not helping us for them to print money. It's only hurting us. So they're seeing firsthand the effects of this money printing. And it's like, it's such a powerful statement for them to call out the central banks to say, we are tired of the debasement of the money supply. And so we're going for something that is determined by code that has a limited supply. We're going with Bitcoin. It was so powerful. I was at the presentation where they announced this, and oh my God, I have never seen such an uproar from the crowd. Everyone just like on their feet, just shouting. It was so loud because people understood what this meant. This is like the first step in what could be a flurry of maybe other countries following suit if they're in a similar position to El Salvador. But Nate, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I think that also it's kind of interesting that after this, the president also tweeted that any crypto traders that wanted to come to El Salvador could be instantly granted citizenship. So kind of another play for him to increase the GDP of his country by getting a bunch of rich people to move there.
So now one thing that kind of didn't move around this. Sorry, go ahead, David.
I think he said residency, not citizenship, but that's a nuance. So
thanks for that clarification. Yeah. So structurally, this is significant. I want to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Ben, we were watching market reaction around this, and it didn't really seem like this moved the needle. What's the kind of thought there? I was
going to say that the lack of market reaction maybe is more to the point in that sense. There just wasn't a lot of movement on the price point with this announcement. I thought that was, an interesting contrast. Naomi, you mentioned like the crowd that was viewing this was kind of, raucous and really enthusiastic about it. But yet, like, we're not seeing the price trade up or trade down. And I think that's particularly maybe interesting on the one hand. I would maybe say frustrating on the other, because I think when we see like Elon Musk move markets with a tweet, the lack of like a country potentially adopting this as like legal tender, not moving it, just shows sort of the chaotic nature of how these things move. So that's my personal frustration in this regard. But I do think it's really interesting. And I do think it continues this experiment that we've been seeing of, centralized actors, aka states, really getting involved in Bitcoin heavily, whether we've been talking about that in relation to Iran or whether we've been talking about that in in relation to, now El Salvador like adopting this. I think it's just really fascinating to see how a centralized entity is acting or going to be interacting with something as decentralized as crypto, and then what inevitable conflicts are going to come out of that.
So now, one thing that's been really interesting to me, and frankly, I really want to echo everything that Naomi said earlier in this segment. I think that this is significant from a variety of reasons, but I think we can draw back and look at what Venezuela did with the cryptocurrency some years back, and we can draw some kind of interesting comparisons between those. So now, both of these nominally are supposed to help with remittances, make things less expensive. They, again, in the case of Venezuela, ameliorate sort of the effects of sanctions that prevent them from using the traditional financial system. But Venezuela created their own cryptocurrency that their government has the power to issue, backed by their own assets, which means that you have to trust the government. And I think that that's kind of the key difference that we're really seeing here with this one, and why it's so important is that effectively much of the world has outsourced its monetary policy to the United States via the dollar. And that's because the United States, in comparison to a small South American nation, often is seen as a better managed currency. But that's kind of the least dirty shirt. Right, and that's kind of one of those arguments, right? It still is has these problems. It just has them in ways that are better than the local alternative. Bitcoin is in contrast to that. Bitcoin has fixed monetary policy that isn't being conducted for the benefit of any government, and which has a very long-term sort of predictable rollout. And that's kind of why this is such a significant thing from my eyes. David, I saw your hand go up. Where are you?
Yeah, so we need to close out this story, but I just wanted to make sure to drive home the questions about corruption, because there have been coverage that's sort of, frankly, rather vague. The new president has done some stuff to restrain the power of the judiciary, but that comes on the heels of 30 years of corrupt rule by other parties. And I think that the Bitcoin in Iran parallel is also important because, frankly, the US CIA overthrows governments in South America for sport on a regular basis. And if I were a leader of a country like El Salvador, I would be looking not just for monetarily, but politically a way to reduce the power of the US over my domestic economy. And right now, a lot of El Salvador's economy relies not just on remittances from the US, but also aid from the US. So if you can decouple either or both of those a little bit from American political power, that's good for them locally. And to also put that in context, the sort of negative stuff about this president has to be read in that context of, these overthrows are often sort of previewed by negative press coverage in the US.